Alright, welcome back to a brand new video. My name is Anson, and in this video, you are all going to learn the basics of Nest.js. So basically, by the end of this video, you'll learn everything about controllers, providers, middleware. You'll learn about validation when you need to, validate a request body. You're going to basically learn how to build a web application, okay? So before we get started, let's just give a little brief introduction with what exactly Nest.js is. So Nest.js is a web framework that allows you to build backend applications, specifically backend, in Node.js. Many people in the Node.js ecosystem tend to use Express, but over the years, lots of frameworks have been developed inspired by Express. Now, Nest.js is actually built on top of Express. So many of the modules, such as Passport, that you use with your Express application actually works in Nest.js. So you don't need to actually relearn a whole new authentication mechanism, or you don't need to relearn everything all over again. A lot of those packages port very easily into Nest.js, and you'll learn all these things as we progress with our tutorial series. We're not really going to cover authentication in this crash course. We might if we have enough time, but this whole crash course is really just focused on the basics, the fundamentals. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's stop talking. Let's get right into the tutorial. So the very first thing that I need to mention is that if you are a fast learner, you can definitely visit the NestJS docs, or you can use the NestJS docs and follow along with the tutorial if you prefer using both documentation and video tutorials. But this is the website docs.nestjs.com, and they have the documentation on NestJS is absolutely amazing. Everything that I've learned from NestJS was literally from the docs. They also have a Discord server too. I'll leave both of those links in the description. And Discord server, they have very friendly and helpful people, so you can always go there to grab help. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So the first thing that we'll need to do is install the NestJS CLI. So what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and type in npm-i-g at nestjs/CLI, and you're going to hit enter. So let's just do that real quick, and this should give you the latest version of the NestJS CLI. And the CLI tool is going to allow you to actually create a NestJS project. It's basically just going to generate all of the necessary files that you'll need to actually bootstrap your project. In other words, it basically scaffolds a ready NestJS project. So if I type nest-v, this will tell me the version of the CLI tool, and you'll see that it is version 9. Okay, and if you just type nest, it'll give you a table of things that you can run. So for example, you can do nest-h to get additional help, right? And it'll tell you all the commands that you can run. Okay, the most important one that we'll run right now is the one that will create ourselves a project. So what we're going to do is we're going to run nest new, and then the name of your project. So I'm just going to call this NestJS Crash Course 2022. You can name it whatever you want. It's up to you. Okay. So then it's going to ask you which package manager would you love to use, and you can either select npm, yarn, npm. I personally use yarn, so I'm just going to select yarn. But if you don't use yarn, or if you use something else like npm or pnpm, you can just select that one. So I'll go ahead and select yarn. And then this is going to generate the necessary files for us. It'll create a new directory and then generate the files in that directory. Okay. And by default, it's going to set up a TypeScript project. Now, I should have also mentioned that NestJS is TypeScript first. And also, fun fact, while we're waiting for the installation of our project, NestJS is actually inspired by Angular. So if you come from an Angular background, a lot of the concepts in NestJS is very, very, very similar to Angular. Okay, so we just finished generating our project, so now we can cd into that directory. So nestjs-crash-course-2022, and let's just type ls, and we can see all of our files in this directory. Now I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code, so I'm going to open this project in Visual Studio Code right now. And let me just move the project over here, or the text editor, and then we're good to go. So now let's go ahead and actually run our project. So if you look at the package.json file real quick, you can see that we have a bunch of scripts. Okay, I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but let me zoom in just a little bit. But you'll see that the important ones that we'll need are nest start dev or start colon dev. So this is going to run our application in development mode. And essentially what that does is it allows us to make changes to our application. And every single time we do, it's going to auto reload the whole application. So that way we don't have to manually restart. Okay, this speeds up development. When you're ready to start your app in production mode, essentially what you could do is you just run start prod. Okay, but you also want to make sure you build your application first. We'll worry about these concepts later on. But for now, let's just go ahead and run. So I'll run yarn start colon dev, but if you're using npm, you'll do npm run start dev. Okay, yarn start dev. So that's going to run our API in watch mode, and you're going to see that in just a second. Right over here, we're going to get some nice logging. And one thing that I want you to pay attention to is what is being logged. Okay, so you see that it says starting Nest application app module dependency initialized. That's good. That means everything's great. And it says app controller. Okay, that was initialized, and it mapped the base route, which is the slash. So if we were to go into our API, so let's go to localhost port 3000 because that's the default port. You'll see that it says hello world. Okay, so that means it actually works. Okay, this is the route that we're visiting, and the response is hello world. Pretty cool. So now that we have our project up and running, let's go ahead and just talk about the files real quick. So the very base project, when you first generate it, it'll create one controller, one module, one service, and then a test file, also known as the spec file. So this right over here, app.controller.spec.ts, this is the test file for the app controller. Okay, so if you were to run this test, it should succeed, assuming that you have not made any changes. But don't worry about this. I'm going to go ahead and just delete this file because we are not going to use it. Okay, and I'm also going to delete the controller as well because we're not going to be using this. I'm going to show you how we can create our own. Okay, and we're not going to delete the app.module.ts file because this is the main module. Okay, this, you can think of this as the root module. Okay, so because we did delete the controller file, I will have to remove this import line. Okay, so this import app controller from /app.controller, we're going to delete that. And I'm going to remove this reference over here because that no longer exists. And I'm also going to delete the app.service.ts file. So this is a service file over here, and we'll explain a little bit more about this in just a second. Let me just delete that. And I'm going to remove that import for the service file, and then we'll remove the app service reference from the providers array. Okay, great. So let's go into the main.ts file. So this main.ts file is basically the entry point to the application. You can see that right over here we have this bootstrap function, and all of the initialization, like for example when you create the Nest app, when you listen to the port, all of that takes place inside this function, and it calls that function. Okay, and then it'll just run all the code inside here. So if you want to register middleware, if you want to configure libraries like passport, sessions, you would do that inside this bootstrap function. Okay, you can see right over here that we are calling app.listen, and then we're passing in port 3000 because that's the default port. You can go ahead and change this to whatever port you want. I usually set it to port 3001, so I'll just change it to that. And then what I'll do is I'll just restart it. Oops, we'll just restart the project real quick, and then we should just be able to go to port 3001. Although nothing will return because we don't have a controller. You can see that it says cannot get, and that's absolutely fine. We're going to go ahead and create a controller right now. Okay, so let's go back to our terminal and let's exit out the application, and we're going to use Nest CLI, and we're going to generate a controller. So we're going to type nest generate controller. Okay, now if you also want to get a list of all of the different schematics, is what they call it, that you can generate, you can just type nest generate, and it'll give you a list, or nest generate help, I think. There we go. So it'll tell you all of these schematics that are available. So you can generate controllers, you can generate guards, modules, whatever you want. Okay, so let's just generate a controller. And then we're going to call this controller. Actually, you know what? Let me generate a module first. So let's generate a module. And what I'm going to call this module is I'll call this users module. So we're going to create an endpoint that will return a bunch of users. So we'll generate a module first, and then inside that module, we'll generate a controller. So you can see that when we generate a module, we have a subfolder inside the source folder. That's great. Let me zoom in a little bit more. And you can see that this users.module.ts file has been created. Okay, and it has this class called users module, and then it has this decorator module, which tells Nest that this is a module. Okay, that's what this annotation or decorator is for. And then inside the app.module.ts file, it'll automatically import the module that you just created, and then add that import reference inside the array for imports. So it does everything automatically for you when you use the CLI. So you don't have to manually configure things yourself. So now that we've created a module, let's go ahead and generate a controller inside that module. So we want to obviously group everything together. We don't want all of our files scattered all over the place. So we're going to generate a users controller that's going to belong to the users module. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and type nest generate controller, and I'm going to pass in the path for the users module /users. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and generate a subfolder called controllers, and then I think I'll do /users. So that should create a users controller inside the controllers folder. So let's hit enter and let's see what happens. And now you can see that inside the users folder we have a subfolder called controllers. Okay, now you might have other controllers inside this users controllers folder, so it's good that it creates a subfolder inside controllers for the users controller folder. Okay, but you can also move these files around if you want to. It's up to you. Okay, but let's go ahead and look at the files that has been created. So we have this users.controller.ts file. We have the users.controller.spec.ts file. So every single controller that you will create will also create a spec file, okay, which is the test file. As well as if you generate a service as well, it'll also generate a test file as well. Okay, we'll generate a service later on in this course. So let's go ahead and look at the controller real quick. You can see that this controller is basically just a class, and above this class it has the controller decorator, which basically tells Nest that this is a controller. And the parameter that is passed into this decorator is users, and this is basically going to be the API route. Okay, so for example, if we wanted to visit routes for this controller, we would have to prefix them with /users. Okay, and you'll see that in just a second. But one more thing that I do want to mention is that if we look inside our users module.ts file, you can see that the users controller was automatically imported because we used the CLI to generate it. And then the reference of that import was passed into this array for the controller's property. So like I said, when you use the CLI tool, it'll do everything for you. And because we are working everything inside our module, we don't even need to worry about modifying app.module.ts, because everything that we configure inside users module will be reflected because we are already importing users module inside app.module.ts. Okay, so now let's go ahead and handle our first GET request. So we're going to go inside users controller, and before we do anything else, let's also just run our code. Okay, so yarn start :dev, and you're going to see that it says the routes resolver. Okay, it says users controller /users route was resolved, so that's good. That means that it works. Okay, it's actually able to pick up requests. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and handle a GET request. So to handle a GET request, the first thing that you're going to have to do inside your controller is define a method. Okay, since we're inside a class. So I'm going to go ahead and name my method. Let's call this get users. So this will basically be a function that would typically return a list of users to the user consuming this endpoint. So we have our function, or I should say method, right? Because we're inside a class. And now what we want to do is we want to use a decorator. the get decorator specifically. And the get decorator is imported from NestJS common. Okay, so we can just import that up top over here. And then we're going to basically invoke this function. Decorators are basically just functions. Okay, so basically now, the next thing that we could also do is we could also pass in an argument inside this get function, right? We can pass in an argument to define the route for this endpoint. So for example, the base endpoint, the base URL is /users, but if we wanted to do something more advanced, such as fetch, right? In order for us to hit this specific endpoint, we would have to visit /users/fetch. But for now, I'm just going to leave this alone. And basically, if it's empty, that means that the base URL will just be /user, and you'll see that in just a second. So I'm going to return an object, and I'll just say, let's just go ahead and return a fake user. We'll just say username Anson, email Anson@anson.com. And let's go ahead and visit the endpoint. So you're going to go ahead and see in the logs, it'll say, because we now have an endpoint defined inside our controller, it'll go ahead and tell you mapped/users. So now that route can actually be visited. Okay? So if I were to go to localhost port 3001/users, I'm going to go ahead and get back JSON. Okay? And it says username Anson, email Anson@anson.com. Of course, if I were to remove this entirely and save, I would refresh, and it's going to go ahead and say cannot get because we don't have an actual endpoint. Okay, so that's good. That's good. We can actually handle get requests. So let's go ahead and create another get request with a more explicit route. So we'll go ahead and do something where it'll be something like /users, and maybe the user might have posts. Okay, so we could do something like /users. Or not users, something like /posts. And now you don't even need the slash, so we can just remove that. And we can just name this method get users posts. Okay. And I'll just go ahead and just return an array. And let me also fix this to an array as well, because it's an array of users. So this endpoint could also return maybe all the users, including their posts, right? If you want to be more specific. But again, everything that I'm showing you is just going to be, it's just going to be examples. They're not going to be real life, responses, right? They're just examples. So treat them as examples. Okay. So for example, this user could have an array of posts, and then we can just type, a bunch of posts, something like that. Again, just an example. Okay. So let's just save this, and let's just visit the endpoint. So we're going to have to visit /users/posts. And you're going to see, oops. Okay, so you can see that now it returns an array of objects, okay? And we have our username and email, and then now we have our posts. So this is how you can create more defined routes, okay? And you can also, again, nesting routes is very simple. If you wanted to create another route, something like maybe users, or not users, posts / let's do something like comments, right? You can retrieve all the comments of a post, right? We can go ahead and do something like get users posts comments, and then we can return maybe the posts. Maybe we can return a single post with its comments. So let me just return a post and comments. Okay, and then let's just refresh, or let's go to the /comments route, and then there you go. You have your nested route. So I'm just showing this to you just as an example, okay, just so that you are aware of how you can actually nest routes. Okay, so I encourage you to play around with this and try to create your own nested routes and think of ways that you can return data based on the nested route that the user would visit. Alright, so now that you know how to handle get requests, let's go ahead and make this a little bit more complicated, and let's learn how to handle post requests. So post requests basically are used for creating a resource on the backend server. So for example, if you were to create a register form, right, that register form, when the user submits their data, it's supposed to make a post request to the server. Okay, so to handle post requests, that we would do the same thing with get requests. We would define a method. So let's define a method called create user. And what we'll do is we'll use a post decorator or the post decorator. And that's also imported from nest.js/common package. And this is also a decorator, so we're going to invoke it, remember, because it's a function. And similarly to the other routes, we could also pass in an argument here, which would represent the sub route or the nested route. So for example, if you wanted to do something like /users/posts, you just name that endpoint posts. So in order to make a post request that would invoke this method, you would have to make a post request to /users/posts. Okay, but we're just going to leave this alone. And what we'll do is we'll send a request body to this endpoint. But how do we handle request bodies? Well, what we want to do is we want to use this rec decorator. And it's just basically short for request. Okay, so this is a function. And then what we can do is we can name the argument request. And the data type for this is actually going to be request. Okay, and it's the interface that comes from the Express package. So remember how I said earlier that Nest is built on top of Express? So a lot of the data types and interfaces and all of those classes are going to be, a lot of them are used from Express. So you want to make sure you type annotate it from the interface that comes from Express, not from anything else. So make sure you import it from Express. Import request from Express. Okay? So what we can do now is we can go ahead and console log the request body, and I'll just return a response. And because we're actually passing in the request argument inside this method, we do need to also get the response body as well. So we can use the res decorator, similar to the rec decorator, but res is for response. And then we'll name the argument response, and then we type annotate it with the response interface that is imported from Express as well. Okay, so similar to Express, you would do response.send, and you can send whatever you want. Well, I'll just send a string for now. Okay, so now to test this, I'm going to use Postman. You can use curl, or you can use PowerShell. I think it's invoke rest method for PowerShell, but you can use whatever method you want to test this post request. I will just simply use Postman. All right, so I'm on Postman right now. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I select post, and I'm going to go ahead and type in the URL. So HTTP localhost port 3001. Let me zoom in a little bit more. Okay, so localhost port 3001, and the endpoint is /users. Okay, just /users. Okay, and now let's go ahead and just click send, and you'll see that we get a 201 created because it is a post request. So by default, Nest actually handles that. So it'll send back a 201 by default. Okay, and obviously we didn't pass in the request body, but if you look at the console, you'll see that it's an empty object. Okay, and Nest also automatically takes care of parsing request bodies, so you don't have to do that yourself. Compared to Express. Okay, so let's go over to the body tab, and let's go ahead and pass in some JSON for the request body. And I'll just go ahead and pass in a username, Anson. Let's do an email as well, anson@anson.com. And let's click send. And let's look at the logs, and you'll see that we have our request body, and it is also parsed into JSON, which is perfect. Okay, so that's good. We know that we have the request body, and it works perfectly. So now you would be able to take this data, and you could do whatever you want. You can save the data to a database. You can pass this data to another API or another microservice. You can do whatever you want. Okay, so that's how you would handle post requests. Okay, and of course, again, if you wanted to create like a nested route or like a sub route, right? You can just pass in an argument for the post method, and then now if I were to make a request to /users for post, it would not work. I would have to make it to /users/create, and then it would work. Cool. So that's how you handle post requests in Nest.js. All right, so it's great that you can actually get the request body from referencing request.body, similar to Express, and you can also reference all of the other properties, such as the query parameters. You can reference the route parameters, headers, similar to how you would do in Express. Actually, it's pretty much exact, right? But we don't want to do things the Express way because, again, Nest is built on top of Express, but Nest also does provide a lot of utilities and functionalities that makes the code not even look like Express. So I'm going to show you how we can actually handle request bodies the NestJS way. And the reason why we're going to do this is because, one, it's going to be a lot more cleaner. It's going to make validating your data a lot more easier. And when you want to unit test your code, it's going to be much more simpler. So let's go ahead and do that. So instead of actually getting the request object argument, right, let's just go ahead and remove this whole thing real quick. Okay, and what we're going to do instead is we're going to use the body decorator. So this is also a decorator that's imported from NestJS Common. Okay. And then what we want to do is we want to name our parameter. You can name it whatever you want. You can name it something like user payload or user data, right? You can name it whatever you want. Okay. Now here's the next part. We need to type annotate our argument, but what exactly do we type annotate it with? Okay. So what you would type annotate this with is what is called a data transfer object. Okay, so basically data transfer objects represent it's basically a schema that represents and defines how data will be sent over the network. So to make things simple, they basically are going to represent the request body. Okay, so if the request body, let's say if we're building a registration form, we need to make sure the user provides a username, password, email, and maybe their full name. So what we would do is we would create a data transfer object that literally defines all those properties and their data types, okay? And then we would use that to type annotate our user data argument, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and create a folder called DTOs inside the users module. And I'll create a new file and I'll call this create user. Let's call it create user DTO.ts, okay? And in the Nest, actually, you know what? I'll call it create user.dto.ts because that's what the NestJS docs does, and I want to be consistent with the NestJS docs. So let's do that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create a class called create user DTO. Okay, and then we're going to define all of the properties that we'll need. So for example, we'll need a username, and the data type is going to be a string. And then we'll also need an email, and the data type will be a string. And you can add whatever fields or properties that you want. Okay, so now that we're done, all we're going to do now is we're going to type annotate this user data argument with that DTO class. So create user DTO, that's going to be imported from up top here. And watch what happens when I console log user data. Okay. And let's just go ahead and return an empty object. So let's go ahead and call this endpoint with a post request. So it's going to return an empty object. And remember, because it's a post request, Nest will handle the status code for us, unless there was an error that happened, right? But if we look at the logs, you can see that we have our object. Now this is nice because now I can actually reference the properties. I have type safety, so I can actually reference the properties, and I have IntelliSense over here. Okay, whereas if we just reference request.body, TypeScript wouldn't know what the actual data types are. So that's good. So now one thing that I will mention, and we will talk about this later on in the crash course, if we were to omit properties from our request body, there's no validation that is happening right now. Okay, so by default, it's not going to validate anything for you. But later on in this course, you'll learn how to validate your request bodies. We're not going to worry about that right now. Okay, but now you know how you can actually use the body decorator and type annotate your request body so you don't have to use the request object itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on, and let's just go ahead and talk about other things that you can do with the routes. So for example, if you wanted to work with route parameters, the way that you would do it in Nest is let's just first define a method. So I'll call this getUser by ID. Okay, and I'm going to use the get decorator, And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in the name of the parameter, but we have to prefix it with a colon. So we're going to prefix it with a colon, ID, just like that. Okay? So now we can actually pass a route parameter, and Nest would actually recognize that endpoint. Now the next question is, how do we actually get the route parameter? Well, again, you can use the request object, but again, that would be doing things the express way. We want to do it the nest.js way. Okay, so for example, if I were to just do request, and let me just go ahead and get the response object real quick, and let me console log request.params, right? I'm not going to send the response. Let me just do this /users. Let's do 1, 2, 3. Let's see what's going on here. Oh, wait, I think we do need to send a response. Whoops. Okay, let's do that real quick. Okay, so you can see that right over here that the request.params object does give us the request parameters, but again, we want to do things the NestJS way. So instead of doing that, we would use the param decorator. Okay, and that is also going to be imported from NestJS common. And then inside the argument for the param decorator, we're just going to pass in the name of the route parameter. In our case, it's just going to be whatever we named it up here. Okay, so it's just going to be ID. And then what we want to do is we want to type annotate the argument. So it's going to be ID string. So now what I'll do, and I'll console log the ID. I'll just go ahead and return the ID. So let's go ahead and click send, and you're going to see that's just going to return us whatever ID that we specify as the value for the route parameter, which is pretty cool, and that's how you handle route parameters. It's very similar to how you do it in Express, except for the way that you extract the parameter. Okay, and of course you can also have nested. You can have nested route parameters as well. So let's say we want to do something like /ID / and then let's do post ID, just an example, right? And then I can extract that parameter as well. So since I named it post ID, that's what I'll have to pass in, and then post ID, and then it's going to be a string. Okay, so now if I wanted to just send 2 route parameters, I could. Okay, so let's do 300 and just do 400, and then you'll see that's what happens. So that's how you can work with route parameters. Okay, next thing that I'll talk about is query parameters, and then we'll move on. So with query parameters, in Express you would reference request.query, but in NestJS we have a decorator called query, and that allows you to extract the query parameters. So let's say, for example, query parameters are best for whenever you want to do filtering. So things like, filtering by the user's, email or their username, or when their account was created, things like that, right? You would use query parameters for that. So let's go ahead and let's do something like this. Let's remove this route parameter over here, and let's just remove this, and let's just also remove this. So we'll just return back to only the ID as the route parameter. Okay, so the next thing that we'll talk about are query parameters. So query parameters are best used for doing actions such as filtering. So for example, if you want to filter users based on what the first name, so what the first letter of their alphabet starts with, you could do something like that. If you want to sort by alphabetical order, or which user was created first, you could use query parameters for that. They're also good for pagination as well. But what I'll do is I'll show you how we can handle query parameters. So I'll use this get users route. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and use the query parameter decorator. That's also going to be imported from the NestJS common package. And we're going to pass in the name of the query parameter. So in our case, we'll just have something, let's do something like sort by, right? And then I'll just call the argument sort by, and then I'll console log sort by, and I'll show you how we're going to work with this. So let's go ahead and go to the get users route, which is just the the base users endpoint. So let's go to here, and you can see right over here if I make a request in the console, it's just going to log undefined because we did not send that query parameter. But if I go ahead and send it right now, so if I do question mark sort by equals, and let's just do something like I don't know, ascending order, ASC. ASC is short for ascending, so let's do that. And if I look at logs, you'll see that it says ASC. Okay, you can also add as many query parameters as you want. Okay, similar to the route parameters, and then you can extract them however you want. Okay, so that's pretty cool. That's how you can work with query parameters. All right, so now that we know how to work with get and post requests, and we also know how to work with the query parameters as well as route parameters, the next thing that we're going to move on to is validation. Validation is something that is very, very, very important when you're building web services, because if you let your users send data to your server without validating it, you're going to run into a lot of issues. It could break your application. It can make your application more vulnerable to malicious data being sent in the request body. So it's very important that you validate all of your request bodies. So I'll show you how to validate the request body for our create user endpoint, and then I'll also show you how we can validate other things such as query parameters as well as route parameters. So let's work with just the request body first. So let's revisit our create endpoint. So let's make a post request to /users/create. So you'll see that our create user DTO, right, we have two properties defined, username and email, but we're still able to send a request body without the email just fine. Okay, and that's not good, because what if we want to create an application where we want users to sign up and they just don't send certain fields to the server? Okay, you want to make sure you're validating the data and making sure that they actually send the required details, the required fields. So let's go ahead and actually validate our request body. So in order to do this, we're going to need to install an additional package. So we're going to need to install class validator as well as class transformer. And if you need a reference to using validation, you can just go ahead and visit the NestJS docs, go over to techniques, and then select the validation section. Okay, they'll tell you everything. But let's just go ahead and install class validator and class transformer. Okay. So once that's done, let's just rerun our application again. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do this. We're going to go into the create user DTO. Okay. And so far right now, nothing's happening, right? We installed those packages, nothing has happened. Okay, just want to make sure. Let's go inside the DTO, and we're going to go ahead and annotate our properties. Okay, you don't have to annotate every single one, but you should annotate the ones that you must have the user send to the server. So in our case, we're going to make both the username and email required fields that the user must send to our API. So for the username, we're going to use a decorator called isNotEmpty. Okay, so this comes from the class validator library. Okay, there's lots of decorators that you can use. So basically, this just validates that the username property is not empty. So let's save this. Okay, and in order for this to work, right? Let's say if I just omit this right now, nothing will happen. In order for this to actually work, you need to actually register the validation pipe for this endpoint. So we can do that very easily by using the use pipes decorator. So right on top of the method create user, and then all we can do is just pass in a new instance of validation pipe like this. Whoops, yep, whoops, like that. So let's save, and let's go ahead and make a request, and you're going to see now it's going to give you an error. It gives you a 400 status code, and it says username should not be empty. That's good. Okay, that means that it's actually validating the data. So let's also validate the email as well. So the nice thing about class validator is it has lots of different decorators, and it has very specific ones too. So one of the ones that I like to use a lot whenever I'm building applications for email, where the user has to enter the email, is I like using the isEmail decorator. Okay, and then you can also pass in options too if you want to configure it. But this will ensure that the email property is actually an email. So let's save this, and let's also make sure that it's not empty as well. But even if the user were to send in an empty value for email, it would automatically reject that because an empty value is not an email. But let's just go ahead and send, and you'll see that it's going to give you all of the errors, right? It says username should not be empty, email should not be empty, email must be an email. Okay, so now let's just go ahead and actually pass in values. And if I just hit send, it's gonna, oh wait, let's send again. It's gonna now give me an error for email, but not for username. Okay, now of course if I were to remove that is not empty, and if I hit send, it's gonna complain saying email must be an email, obviously because email is not defined, right? Or whoops, let me just fix that. There we go. See, must be an email. So you could add that is not empty if you want to. Well, let's just leave it like that for now. So let's go ahead and just add an email. So let's just say Anson. And notice how if I just hit enter, right, it's not going to work because it says email must be an email. Anson is not an email. But if we do something like @ right, gmail.com, then it'll work, right? It's very, very good. I really like using this validator a lot. Okay, so that's pretty much how you can validate post requests. Pretty cool. So let's go ahead and validate other things such as query parameters as well as route parameters. So let's say, for example, right, if we look at our get user by ID method over here, you can see that by default, all of the route parameters as well as query parameters will be strings. Right, but what if we want our route parameter to actually be a number, right? What if we want the user to ensure that they are providing numeric values for the ID, right? Well, they certainly will provide a numeric value, but it'll just be converted as a string, right, by default. But what we can do is we can actually get it to automatically convert to the correct data type. In our case, we want to convert it to a numeric value. So what we can do is, as a second parameter, or as a second argument for this param decorator, I can go ahead and pass in the parse int pipe, okay? And that's going to be imported up top over here from NestJS common package, okay? And so what this will do is it'll basically just parse this ID into a numeric value. So instead of type annotating as a string, we will type annotate it as a number, okay? So let's go ahead and try to visit this route. So let's make a get request to users /1. Okay, and if we look at the logs, it's going to go ahead and log 1. Now, if we did not parse this, and if I were to just send this again, you're going to see that now it sends it as quotes, right? And you can see that the logs over here. So in the terminal, it'll actually color code the numeric values. You can see over here it's just a plain white value, okay? But if I were to change it back to parse int pipe, and if I were to click send, you can see that now it sends back the ID in a numeric value because it doesn't have quotes, and in the terminal the color is yellow. So that's a good indicator that it is working. If I were to go ahead and just pass in like a string value, it's going to throw an error. It says validation failed, numeric string is expected. So that's good. We know that we can validate our route parameters, and this is good because if you're building APIs that expect numeric IDs, which typically IDs are usually, most of the time are numeric, assuming that if you're using like MySQL, then you can use parse int pipe to validate that, which is good. Okay, and of course, if you wanted to parse your query parameters, you could also do that as well. So let's go ahead and also parse query parameters as well. So let's say if I wanted to have a query parameter be a Boolean value, I can use a parse bool pipe. Okay, so I'm going to call this query parameter. Actually, no, I'm just going to remove this. I'm going to change this to, let's call this sort ASC, or sort desk for sort descending. Okay, and then the data type for this will be boolean. Then we're going to use the parse bool pipe, and that'll be imported up top there. Okay, so just note that using this pipe will also ensure that you must pass that query parameter. So if I were to make a request, it's going to say validation failed. So let's just do sort desk. And if I were to pass in a string, you're going to see it says validation failed because it's not a Boolean value. If I pass true, then it's going to succeed. If I pass false, it'll succeed. If I pass 1, it won't work. Or 0, yeah, those won't work either. So it must be an actual true or false value, right? True or false. So that's how you can parse query parameters. And again, you can do the same thing if you want it to be a numeric value. Okay, you would just use parse int pipe. Okay, there's lots of different pipes, so I encourage you to play around with it. Let's say if you want to validate files, you could use the parse file pipe. If you want to validate arrays, you can do that. Many different pipes, okay? So I encourage you to play around with it. Okay, so that's how you can do validation. Before we move on, I also did want to mention something real quick. If you wanted to use other HTTP methods, such as put, delete, patch, right? They have all of those decorators that you can import from NestJS Commons. So you can see over here, if you wanted to use the patch method, you would just import that decorator. If you wanted to use put, all right, you would use that decorator. If you wanted to use delete, you'd use that decorator. So I figured I would mention that so you all are aware of those decorators. I'm not going to cover those because it's just really the same thing as every other, as the get and post decorators anyways. Everything that you would do when it comes to route parameters and query parameters and validation, it's all the same. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next topic. So right now we're going to go ahead and talk about services and providers in Nest.js. So basically, providers are a fundamental concept in Nest, so you need to understand what exactly they are. But many providers are just classes in Nest, and providers consist of things like services, repositories, factories, and if you were to work with authentication, things like strategy files, guards are also providers as well. Okay, the thing that you must understand with providers are that providers are injected as a dependency. So one of the things that you also should read up on is dependency injection. We're not going to go in depth on dependency injection in this tutorial. We'll talk about that maybe in a more in-depth tutorial later. But Nest.js uses dependency injection. And the whole point of dependency injection is to create one instance, store that instance inside a container that the framework manages, and anywhere in your application that you need that instance, you inject it in the application, in the part of the application, instead of creating a new instance. Okay, using up memory every single time you create a new instance. So in order to take care of Nest.js's providers fundamental feature, we are going to create our very own service. Okay, so now that you understand what providers are, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about services. So services are responsible for taking care of work inside your application, right? You're probably wondering, well, can't I just do everything inside the controller, right? I've already taken in the request inside the controller. Can't I just invoke a database or invoke some external API, get the response, and then return that to the user? Well, you could, right? But the whole purpose in frameworks like Nest.js is to separate every single thing in its own responsible class, right? So typically controllers are responsible for handling the request, such as taking in the request, extracting any necessary data, such as query parameters, route parameters, request bodies, validation, which we've already done already, right? Thanks to the validation pipe. If you want to do additional things as well that are related to handling, request bodies, you would do that inside the controller. Okay, and of course, controllers are also responsible for returning responses to the user. Okay, but controllers typically should not contain any business logic related to what's supposed to happen underneath the hood, such as fetching users. The controller typically should not call a database directly. That should be done in the service layer, and the service layer uses something called a repository, which we will talk about later. Okay, but hopefully you understand that it's not good to have everything done at the control layer. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a service, and that service is going to just return a list of users. Okay, and I'm going to show you how from the controllers we can invoke the service. Okay, and of course everything that we're going to do, we're not going to do anything with a database just yet. We're only going to use fake data. So let's go ahead and generate our service. So we're going to go into our console, and we're going to use the Nest CLI to do this. So we're going to type nest generate. Now, one thing that I should mention is that if you just do nest g, that'll be G is short for generate. Okay, and if you want to generate a service, you just type service, or you can type S for short. Okay, so nest.js, which is basically stands for nest generate service. Okay, and then what we can do is we can pass the path similar to what we did with the controller. So the path to the users module, we'll create a new folder called services, and then I'll call the service users. Okay, so let's just hit enter, and you're going to see that it's going to create a services folder inside the users module folder right over here. Okay, so inside the service folder, it created a users folder, and we have the service file, which is a class, and then we have the service.spec.ts file, which is the test file for the service. Okay, so every single service that you generate will have a test file. Okay, and you can see that inside the users.module.ts file, it also automatically imported the user service, and it added that user service reference inside the array for the providers. Okay, so now that we have our user service, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and actually mention a couple things. So you'll notice that our user service is a class, and you'll also notice that on top of the class it has this injectable annotation, or decorator I should say, right? This is very important because every single provider must have this injectable decorator, and that basically just means that this class is a provider and that you can actually use dependency injection. Nest will be able to use dependency injection to inject this service anywhere in your application that needs it. Okay, so later on, like for example, if we were to create another controller that needs the user service, instead of creating a new instance of user service, it would actually take the already created instance that is managed by the IOC container, which stands for inversion of control container, right? It's going to be managed by the container, and it's going to take that instance from the container and inject it into the controller that needs it, or anywhere else that you need it, right? Anywhere in your application. Other services might also need to inject other services, so that's also something to mention as well. Okay, but right now our controller needs our user's service, so let's go ahead and inject it inside the user's controller. So the way that you inject your dependency is you go ahead and you implement a constructor for the class for your controller. And it's similar for services too. So if you were to inject a service in another service class, you would also do it in the constructor as well. So what we want to do is we want to do private, which is a keyword, right? Private, and then the name of the user service, so user service like this. And then we want to type annotate this variable as user's service. Okay, so what's going to happen is it's going to use dependency injection to inject this user service into our controller. Okay, now right now we actually don't even have any methods defined inside user service. So let's go ahead and define some. So remember, our service class typically is responsible for handling business logic. So business logic can consist of literally anything that your application needs to do. So in our case, our business logic would be something like fetch all users, right? So we're going to go ahead and create a method called fetch users, and it's just going to return a fake array or fake data. Like I said, it's going to return fake data. But the whole point is to separate all of your responsibilities down to its corresponding layer. Okay, so we're in the service layer right now. The service layer, like I said, we can pretend like it's calling a database, right? It's calling MySQL or MongoDB, and then we're going to return whatever that is. So I'll actually just define a property called fake users. And then I'll just go ahead and ascend the array, and then we'll just return the array like this. Oh, that's actually has to be this dot fake users. There we go. Whoops. Okay, so let's go ahead and now let me also remove this query parameter because I don't really need it. Let me go ahead and just return. So we're gonna go ahead and call this dot user service dot fetch users, and let's save, and let's go ahead and start up our application again, and let's see how everything works. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and call the slash users endpoint, and you're going to see it's going to return our fake data, right? So what happened was we called our user service dot fetch users method, okay, and that method returns our fake users. That's really all it does. Okay, and again, like I said, you could pretend that this calls some kind of database, but later on, I will show you how we can set up databases. Don't worry about that. Okay, so let's just create some other users. Let's create Corey. Let's create one more. Let's do something like, let's do Greg. Save, and let's make an API call, and you can see we have our users. Okay, again, we're pretending that they're from a database. Okay, and of course, we can also define other methods for our service, right? So if our service, so for example, if our controller has an endpoint to create users, our service should also have a method that takes care of actually creating the user itself. So you can imagine that the service would actually need to take care of creating the record in the database. So let's create a method. Let's create a method called create user. Okay. And what we're going to do is inside our controller, we will go ahead and call this dot user dot create user. Okay. And like I said, because we are already validating the data, we know that user data will be sanitized and it's valid data. So we could just actually directly just pass this data as is like that. Okay. Now, something that you could also additionally do is you could create a custom type for the user data, because you don't really want to reuse the DTO, but just to make things, just to simplify things, I'll go ahead and reuse the DTO. The reason why I say this is because not every single property that is defined inside the DTO is actually what you're going to pass in to the create user method, right? Because some properties are just used just for, like, like handling conditions, checking certain things. So that's why I'm saying that you should create a custom type somewhere in your application and then use that. So for example, what I would do is I would do something like this. I would create a new folder called utils, create a file called types, and then assuming that, let me do this, assuming that our data has been validated and we are only using specific pieces of information for the data, I would do something like export type, create user type, and then I'll do something like username string, email string. Okay, and then what you can do is you can just go ahead and do user data, user details, right? And you can type annotate this as create user type. Okay, I'm saying this because you shouldn't really reuse the DTO, but you could if you want to. In our case, we definitely could. Okay, but I'll leave it like this for now. Okay, even though they are the same properties. So I'm just going to go ahead and pass in user data, and we can't because create user DTO and create user type are exactly the same. Okay, but in case in your request body you might need to take out some properties, right, and then pass it into create user, then you would have to create a custom type like we did over here. So let's just move on. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and do this. I'll do this take users dot push user details. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and return. I'll just return nothing, I guess, indicating that it succeeded. And then we can just return whatever create user returns. And so by default, it'll create a 201. If there's any error that happens, Nest will handle that for us, and it'll just return a 400 for us. So let's make a post request now. So we have our request body. Let's click on send. Let's see what's going on here. Oh, /create. Okay, there we go. So we have a 201. So let's make a get request again. And we should see that new user over here. Perfect. Okay, so we know that it works. Let's go ahead and send some more data. So let's make another user. Oh, it's /create. Keep forgetting. And now let's go to the users endpoint. And you can see that we have the new users in the array. And again, like I said, pretend that it is inserting it into the database, which is what the service should be doing. And again, it's the same thing if we were to fetch a user by ID, right? We would create another method in the user service. So fetch user by ID. And then this method would expect an ID, right? So let's get the numeric number. And then you would need to call your database, search the database by the ID, search for the user by its ID, and then return that user. I'll just return a fake user. Just like this. And let's just do email. Like that, right? Actually, I'll just return whatever the user passes in for the ID. Okay, so let's go ahead and call this now. So let's do return this dot user service, fetch user by ID, and then we'll pass in the ID. Okay, so our controller has already taken care of validating the route parameter, and we're just going to take that data, that route parameter, and pass it into the service, and let the service do whatever it needs to do, and then we'll return whatever the service returns. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to Postman, and let's just hit that endpoint with the route parameter, and you can see that it's just going to give me the user with the ID with whatever we specify as the route parameter. Okay, and of course in the real application, if the user was not found by its ID, you would have to do a check such as, if the user is null, then you would return null, and then you could just in the controller you would do something like this, right? I'll show you an example real quick. So let's just say, for example, right, let's do something like this. Let's return null, okay, and let's just store this return value in a variable called user, right? So if user was not found, so let's do if no user, we can actually throw an error. We can actually throw an HTTP exception, and you can pass in a response. We can just say user not found, and you can pass in a status, and that's just, we can use the HTTP status enum, and then we can do bad request, which I think is 400, I think, yeah, 400. So if the user is not found, you can just throw an exception, and Nest will handle that exception underneath the hood for you. If the user is found, then you can just return the user like that. Okay? So let me show you how this works. You can see that right over here, it sends us back a 400 because the user was not found. Right? Now let's go ahead and actually send something back, and you can see that it'll send us back the user. So that's how you can actually handle exceptions if you ever need to. Okay, but like I said, NestJS, it handles a lot of stuff for you, and the controller is where you do things that the controller should take care of, right? So for example, if you wanted to check if the user, if you wanted to check if the return value was null and then do something after that, you could do that inside the controller. All right, so the next thing that we'll talk about is middleware. So middleware is basically just a function that is called before the actual route handler. So let's say, for example, before create user, before get user by ID, before get users, let's say I want to perform some kind of task before we actually hit this function, or before we actually call this function, right? Maybe you want to make sure that users are authenticated. Maybe you want to make sure that the user passed in a correct bearer token or authorization token, right? You would typically want to do those things inside a middleware function. Okay, the middleware function has access to the request and response object, and that's how you can actually, modify those objects. So for example, if you wanted to check what the headers are in the middleware, you would use the request object. And additionally, it also has the next middleware function, which just basically allows you to call the next middleware. It's really similar to how you use middleware in Express. Okay, the next function invoke the next function quite literally. So if you have other middleware, it would invoke the next middleware. If you don't, it will just invoke the next route handler, or the route handler after. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set up a very simple middleware. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and inside our users folder, I'll create a new folder called Middlewares. And then we're going to have to create this manually. You could actually just use the Nest CLI to do this, I think. I think if you do nest generate help, I think you could actually use the CLI tool. Yeah, we can actually use the CLI tool, so I'll do that real quick. So since I already created the folder, let me just do nest G for generate, M for middleware. Actually, I'll do middleware because there's two schematics that start with M. So we'll do middleware. Or actually, it would be MI. So MI for middleware, and then we're gonna pass in the path. So /users /middlewares, and then we'll call this middleware example middleware. I don't really know what we're gonna do with this middleware, but I'll just show you how it works at least, so you could do something else yourself. So this is going to generate the middleware, and you can see that it generated inside this folder because we passed in the path. So here's the middleware class. You can see that it has the injectable injectable decorator annotated on top of the class, which means that we can literally inject this anywhere in our application. Okay. So in order for us to actually register our middleware, the first thing I'll do is I'll just go ahead and console log example middleware, just so that we know that it's going to work. And we're going to go inside users module. Now, to register our middleware, we actually don't add it as a provider. We actually need to configure it. Okay, so for our users module class, we're going to implement the nest module interface. Okay, so that's going to be imported from nest.js /common. And then we're going to go ahead and implement the configure method. Okay, and then the argument that this configure method takes is consumer, which is a middleware consumer. And what we're going to do is we're going to reference this consumer, and we're going to go ahead and call the apply method. And we basically want to pass in that middleware class as an argument. So this example middleware. So example middleware. And then we want to specify what routes we want this middleware to work for. So I'm going to specify for the routes. I'm going to go ahead and pass in the user's route like that. Okay, so watch this. We're going to restart our application. And then now, every single time we visit any of our users' routes, it's going to go ahead and call that middleware function for us. So let's go ahead and go to just /users. It gives us back our fake users, and if we look at the console, it says example middleware. Okay, if I were to visit the endpoint /post/create, and I click send, it's going to go ahead and log example middleware. If I were to visit /get and then the ID, so that's the route parameter, right? It's going to also log example middleware. So we know that that's our middleware function working. So if you also wanted to, instead of just passing in the route itself, like the hard-coded route, you could also make it, you could also just pass in, I think, the controller. You should be able to just pass in the controller, I think. So you could do something like this. You could do something like users controller, and that should work as well. So let's test this out. See how it logs example middleware. Perfect. You could also exclude routes if you want to. Okay, and if you didn't want it to work for every single route, and if you want it to be a little bit more explicit, you could pass in options, right? And you can specify the path, and you can also specify the method that you want it to only work for. So, for example, if I want the path to be something like, let me see, yeah. So this is supposed to be, I believe, a string. So let's just do users, and then you want the method. You only want it to work for get requests. So we're going to import request method, and then we're going to reference .get. So this would only work for all routes and users for get requests only. So it would not work for post requests. So if I were to go to this route, let's see what's going on here. Okay, so actually, because we actually specified only the user's route, right? It would only actually work if we visited the user's route. You can see the middleware being logged right now. But if I visit any other route, such as /create, the middleware will not be invoked, as you can see over here. Okay, but if I wanted to additionally add more routes, I could. Right? You can see that if you look at the type, it's literally just an array, so I can just add more routes if I want to. So let's copy that and let's paste this here, and I can do users /:id and save. So now if I were to visit the /users/id route with a GET request, you're going to see that it logs the middleware, or it executes the middleware function because it's logging example middleware. If I were to make a post request, okay, it's not going to do anything. Okay, so that's how you can play around with middleware. You can pass in the entire controller if you want it to work for the whole controller. You can be explicit with the paths. You can do whatever you want. Okay, so that is pretty much it when it comes to configuring the middleware. One more thing that I will also mention is that if you want to actually perform more logic inside the middleware, again, I'm not sure why it generated this function with any. It should really just be request, because it is the data type is actually the request. Same thing with the response as well. So let's do that. And the function should actually be annotated as next function, like that. Okay. So again, you can literally reference all of the properties, right? So you can reference request.body, you can reference request.query. Typically for middlewares, you should do things such as checking the headers, right? For example, request.headers. So I can do something like request.headers. I can check what the authorization header is. So let me just log that real quick. So let me make a GET request real quick. Oops. Let's do that. Okay. So you can see that it's undefined. So let's go ahead and pass in an authorization header. So what I'll do is inside headers, we'll pass in authorization like that. I'll just pass in a random string. Okay, so now you can see that in the console it logs the actual value. So we could do something like this, right? I can go ahead and say let's get the authorization property from request.headers, and I can say something like if authorization is equal to this, or let me actually do this instead. Let's do this. If no authorization, throw new HTTP, and we can actually throw an exception similar to how we did in the controller in the previous part of this video. And I can throw an HTTP exception, and the response can be no authorization token. And then I can go, or I can just say something like invalid authorization token. And for the status, I want it to be a forbidden, which just means it's going to send back a 403. So if the authorization token is in fact defined, we want to compare it to the correct value. And like as I said, this would be any value. I'm just going to put a hard-coded string just for example. So if it is equal, then what I'll do is I'll call next. Okay. Cool. So now if it isn't, I'll throw another error, and I'll say invalid authorization token. Okay. So basically now our middleware has flow, right? So we need to make sure we pass in the correct authorization header. So watch this. So I'm going to go ahead and not pass in the authorization token, and it's going to give me a 403, and that's coming from the middleware. If I pass in the authorization header, but if I pass in an invalid value, it's going to say invalid authorization token. If I pass in the correct one, it's going to call the next function, and that next function is basically just going to invoke the next function, right? That's what it is. And the next function in our case is really just the route handler. Now, one more thing that I will also mention is that if you wanted to apply more middlewares, because sometimes you might have a lot of different middlewares that you want to apply before actually calling the route handler, right? You can also do that, right? You can basically just call apply as many times as you want. So let's go ahead and just create another middleware real quick. So let's just do nest.js. So mi is short for middleware, and I'll call this I'll just call it whatever. So let me pass in the path. So we want this to go inside the /users/middlewares folder. and then I'll just call this middleware another middleware. Again, you can call it whatever you want, but it's just an example. So it's just going to create the middleware file and its test file. Okay. And what we'll do is I'll just write a simple log, and I'll just say console log another middleware. And again, you could perform whatever you want in here, similar to what we did in the example middleware. We checked the authorization token. Maybe this middleware could check some kind of signature. Let's say, for example, if you're working with webhooks typically have, like a webhook secret or a signature that you want to make sure you validate. So you can do that inside here, for example. But I'll just console log something, and then we'll just call the next function. Okay. And then what you want to do is inside the users module, right after we had applied our first middleware, and then after we called for routes, right, we want to go ahead and call apply again, and we want to pass in that another middleware. So we want to import that up top over here, and then we want to specify the routes, of course, because we're not done yet. So for routes, and then again, you can have this, you can just pass in the whole controller to have it work for every single controller, or you can be explicit and have it work for or have it work for only specific routes. So what I'll do is I'll just copy and paste this in here. So literally the same exact routes. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead, and now let's pay close attention to the logs. So if I go ahead and visit the get users endpoint, it's going to get me all the users, and watch what happens. It logs example middleware, it logs the authorization header, and then it logs another middleware. You see how the order of it is actually it's in order, right? It's basically in the order that we applied the middleware. If we were to apply the another middleware first before example middleware, then that function would be called first, right? So for example, if I were to just take this, move this down here, and then if I save and then hit send, you'll see that now it logs another middleware and then example middleware. See how that works? Pretty simple. Right? Pretty straightforward. But yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to middleware. Okay, and finally, if I were to just call the create endpoint, you'll notice that it doesn't invoke the middleware at all. Well, actually, let me save this again, because I think those logs were from previous call. Okay, you'll see that it does not invoke the middleware at all because we did not specify that path. Okay. So that is pretty much most of the things that you'll need to know when it comes to middleware. If you need to know more about the additional things that you can do with middleware, just visit the NestJS docs. There's a section under overview, and just click on middleware, and they'll tell you everything that you need to know. But this is the most basic things that you would need to know when it comes to middleware. Alright, so I want to go ahead and talk about pipes in NestJS. Now, I know earlier we did get a little brief introduction to pipes, but we only really used them but never really understood everything about it. So I want to talk about pipes a little bit, and I'll show you an example of how we can actually create a custom pipe. But before we do that, you need to understand what exactly pipes are really used for. So it has two typical use cases. The first one is transformation. So if you wanted to transform certain properties from, like, a string to an integer, or integer to string, or let's say if the value is supposed to be a Boolean, but it is a string data type, you can convert it from a string to a Boolean. And you can also use pipes for validation, which is what we actually did earlier, right? We used the validation pipe to validate if the request body was valid, if the route parameter was an actual numeric value, okay? And they will throw an error if the data is incorrect. Okay, so we already mostly handled validation, but I'm going to go ahead and show you how we can actually use transformation with pipes, and I'll also show you an example of why you would want to do this. So first thing that I'll do is I'm going to go inside my create user DTO class, and I'll define another property. And what I'll do is I'll call this property age, so the age of the user, and I'll use the is not empty decorator. Now there is actually a decorator called isNumber, but if I use that, that'll defeat the whole purpose of this whole tutorial. So I'm going to show you what's going to happen. Okay, so we have our age property type annotated as a numeric value, a number, and let's go inside our controller now. So let's go ahead and console log user data. Okay, so what I'll do is inside Postman, I'm going to go ahead and pass in the age property, and I'll pass in a number. So you see that it gives me a 201, everything worked fine. And if you look at the logs, you can see that it is actually a number. There's no quotes. Okay, and the color is yellow, which means that, well, in our case, because I'm using PowerShell, I'm not sure if it's going to be different in other terminals, but you can see that it's a number. Okay, now there would be no issue if I were to reference user data dot age, right? I could go ahead and do whatever I want with this, right? I could call toFix to precision, right? If I were to go ahead and call is nan, this should give me false because it is a number, right? Is nan will return true if it's not a number, but in this case, it is a number. Okay, so that's good. We can actually send numeric values. That's great. But what if I were to actually quote this number? Okay, and if I click send, what would happen then? It gives us back a 201. Okay, but see how right now it still says false. But let's go ahead and do this, right? Because isNan, I think it does convert a string into a number before it does before it actually calls the function, I think. But watch this, right? If I were to reference user data dot age, and then if I were to set the type of this, or if I were to use the type of operator, and if I were to click send, notice how the data type, it says string, right? If I change this to a numeric value, the data type is number. So although TypeScript knows that this is a number, or it treats it as a number, it's actually not a number, right? If I were to actually call, let's do something like toPrecision, which I think is a method only on numbers, right? If I click send, it would work. Oh, actually, wait, what's going on? Whoops. Let me move type of. Let me click send. It would work, right? But what if I quote this, and then if I click send, it's going to give me a 500, and you'll see that it says user data.age.toPrecision is not a function, and that makes sense because the actual data type of this is a string. Now, obviously, you could very easily fix this by just using the isNumber decorator, and that would literally fix everything for you, right? If I just click send, it would tell me age must be a number conforming to the specified constraints, right? But in some cases, you might need to transform the data, and that's the whole purpose of this section. So that's why I'm opting out of using that isNumber decorator. So I'm going to show you how we can create a custom pipe and transform that number data type, so that way, or not the number data type, the age property, so that way it's always going to be a number no matter what. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and do this. I am going to go ahead into the Nest CLI tool, and let me just type nestg-h, and we're going to generate a pipe. So I'll type nestg pipe. You could do pi for short, pipe, and it's going to belong inside the users folder /pipes, and we'll just call this validate create user. So that's going to go ahead and create pipes folder, and you can see that it created our pipe for us. And you can see that it creates this class validate create user pipe, which implements pipe transform, which is an interface, and we need to implement the transform method. Okay, so this transform method takes in two arguments, value and metadata. Okay, so value is actually going to give you whatever value that it is that you need, right? So for example, if you're working with a request body, it's going to give you the request body. So I'll show you that real quick. So let's do console log value, and to actually use this pipe, what we'll do is this. I'm gonna go right over here. So inside the body decorator right over here, we're going to basically just pass in the pipe right here. So validate create user pipe. We'll pass in here. We're going to have to import that, of course. Okay. So then it's going to go ahead and invoke this transform method. So I'll go ahead and write an additional console log inside validate create user pipe. Okay. Okay, so I'll log value and I'll also log metadata just so that you can see what these two arguments show. So let's go ahead inside Postman and let's make a request. Okay, so right now it's obviously throwing an error, and that's fine because we are still trying to call that toPrecision function. Okay, because it treats this as a number even though it's a string. But pay close attention to the logs right over here. So this right over here comes from, I believe, value. Yeah, so let's just go here. So you can see it says inside validate create user pipe, and then this is the value of the value argument from the transform method. And then if we look at metadata, metadata basically tells you what type of data this is, right? So in our case, this is actually a request body. Okay, you could keep in mind that you could use pipes for query parameters as well as route parameters as well. Okay, but in our case, we're using it for a request body. So now what we would want to do inside this pipe is we want to transform the age property. So we want to make sure that it's an actual string. Okay, so watch this. So we're going to take we're going to take the value. Okay, and actually one thing that I should also mention is that we can actually just type annotate value as the DTO right over here. Okay, like this. The reason why is because it's actually going to hit the validation pipe first before it actually goes into your validate create user pipe. And to prove that, watch this. If I were to omit this age property, it's going to tell you age should not be empty. Okay, so by the time we are making the request, right, it's going to go through the validation pipe, and then it's going to go to the transformation pipe. And so that's why we can type annotate value as create user DTO. Okay, so that means we can get some IntelliSense, but what I'll do is I'll go ahead and do this. Parse age to int. And I'll do this. I'll call parse int on value dot age. And what I'll do, what's going on here? Number is not assignable to type string. Okay, so so I think it's because it says parse int. Okay, let me call it toString. And again, this is just an example. Okay, the way that you would do things, you might do things differently, right? But this is just an example. So it treats age as a string, but what I'll do is I'll convert it to a string. Okay, and then what I'll do is if parse age to int, or actually we'll use the isNaN function. So if parse age to int is not a number, right? So for example, if the user passed in, you know, ABCD, right? That's obviously not a number. So this function will return true. But if the user passes a quoted numeric value like quote 24, for example, right? Like what we did here, then this would return false because it's still a number, but it's just in string format. So what I'll do is I'll just console log, and I'll say parse to. I'll just say value dot age. Let me do this. Is not a number. Okay, and if it is a number, well, actually, before we do that, let me throw an error, throw a new HTTP exception. And like I said, anywhere you throw an exception, Nest has an exception handler layer. It'll handle all the exceptions for you, so you don't have to even do it yourself. So we'll say invalid data type for number for property age expected number. And then we'll set the HTTP status to bad request. So that will return a 400. So if it is not a number, right, then we'll throw this error. Whoops. Okay. If it is a number, then what we'll do is, well, we already converted this to a number, so we can just literally do this. We can just return, we can do this. We can return value. We can return everything. And then we can override the age property to parse age to int like that. We can do that. Let me also remove these braces because we don't need that. And we actually don't even need this else case because it'll throw a new error, so it'll never go into this return. It will never hit this return. All right, so let's test this out. Okay, so let's do this. Is a number. It's good to write a lot of logs so you all see what's going on. So let's go ahead and click send and see how the error does not happen anymore. So in the controller, we're still trying to call toPrecision, and it works, right? It works because this is an actual number now, okay? Because we transformed it. Originally it was a string because that's what we passed in, but we transformed it to an actual numeric value. So when it went back to this method, userdata.age is actually a number, even though we pass in a string. Okay, you can see that it is being called over here. 24, it's toPrecision right over there. See, it works. And if you see in the logs, we can see that it says 24 is a number returning, okay, even though it's a string. If I pass in, like, a non-valid, if I pass in a non-valid string, what happens here? Why is it saying, oh, you know what it is? I think what happens is it actually gets rid of the rest of the, I think it trims all of the non-numeric characters. Yeah, after 24. Okay, so I think it parsed this first and then it got rid of this. But if I add values in front of it, you're going to see that it says invalid data type for property age, expected number, and it throws that error. Okay, and that's all coming from the pipe. So that's how you can use pipes to transform data. And again, you can use this to transform any property you want, right? You can transform, a string to a number to a string. You can do whatever you want. Okay, so that's how you can use pipes. So that is going to be pretty much it for pipes. I just wanted to, include this so that way you all at least know what you can use pipes for, aside from just, validation. You can use it for transformation as well. Alright, so we're going to move on to the next topic, and we're going to go ahead and talk about guards. So guards are pretty much just a class that have a single responsibility, and all they do is they just determine whether the incoming request can be handled by the controller's route handler. Okay, so it's kind of like, it depends on certain conditions, right? The most easiest example that I could give you is when it comes to authorization or authentication, right? If the user is not authenticated, you'll use something like a guard to prevent the user from accessing an endpoint because they are not authenticated. Or let's say they are authenticated, but they are missing certain permissions, or they don't have a specific role, then you would use a guard to protect that endpoint from that user because they don't have the necessary permissions or roles. Okay, so guards are really great in NestJS because you can use that to implement authorization and authentication at the same time. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and implement a guard. So I'll show you how we can do that. So I'm going to go inside my CLI, my terminal, and I'll go ahead and generate a guard. So we can do that with the Nest CLI. So we'll do nest g guard, and then we're going to pass in a relative path. So we want this to go inside the users folder, the users module. So /users/guard. So that folder will be created inside users. And I'll just call this auth guard. I don't know. I don't really know what a good name to call it, so I'll just call it auth guard. So that's going to create that. So let's look in the folder, and we can see that we now have this guards folder, and it creates the guard file, and it also creates the spec file, which is good. Okay, so now you can see that when we look in the guard file, we see that we have a class, and it's also annotated with the injectable decorator. Okay, because we can inject the guard wherever we want in our application. We can use it in any controller we want. So this auth guard class implements the can't activate interface. Okay, and we need to implement the can't activate method. Okay, so essentially this method is responsible for returning a Boolean value. Okay, and right now it returns true by default. Right, that's what it does. But of course, the most common use case is we want to use the context, right? The execution context gives you information about a lot of different things, and one of the things that it gives you is the request, right? So, for example, if you wanted to get the actual request object, what you would do is you would call the switch to HTTP method, and then you can just call get request like this. Okay, and the data type should actually be request. So what I can do is this const request equals, and then I'll type annotate this as request. Okay, and I'll also console log request headers as well. Okay, and we can console log whatever we want. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna show you a good example of how we can use this guard. But essentially, right now it's just going to return true. Okay, so it's really just going to work every single time. But if it returns false, it'll deny the request. So let me show you how this works. So let's go to auth guard, and we're gonna go ahead and use our guard. So the way we do this is we go to our route. So if you want the guard to work for the whole entire controller, you would use the use guards decorator, and then you would pass in auth guard like this, and you would do that on top of the class itself. If you only want it to work for a single endpoint, then you would only do that for the specific endpoint. Okay, so it depends on your situation, right? Maybe you want to protect every single route, maybe you don't. It's up to you. But let's go ahead and visit the get users endpoint. So that's going to be /get /users, or not /get, get /users. So it's going to give us back our response just fine. But you can see that the guard, the can activate method was invoked because we are logging the headers, right? You can see authorization token, content type, stat, blah, 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 all these things, right? In an actual application, where you have like, sessions and the user logged in, right? Which we're not gonna talk about that in this crash course. That'll be for a separate crash course, which I will make. But typically what you would do is you would, get the request object, you would reference the user property if you're using sessions, right? And then what you could do is you could check to see if the user has a specific role, and that's assuming that the user is actually logged in. You can check if the user has a role, and if the user does have the role, then you can return true. If it doesn't, then you would return false to deny the request, right? So let me show you something real quick. Let's say if I were to return false, okay, and if I were to access this, you're going to see that it now says forbidden resource, right? For whatever reason, it returns false, whether you don't have the role, whether you are missing permissions, whatever it is, right? That's what this auth guard does, okay? But like I said, don't worry so much about the auth guard right now because it really works well when you are using, when you actually have authentication authorization in your application. But we'll save that for another tutorial where we all talk about authentication and authorization. Okay. But yeah, hopefully you understand guards. And if you want to learn more about guards, you can just go over to the docs, and they have a bunch of documentation that teaches you how to use this. Okay, you can see that right over here in this example. They switch the context to HTTP, and then they call the get request method. And then what they do is they let's see what they do here. They actually get the user object, and then they are trying to match the roles. Okay, and yeah, basically it just matches the roles that are required versus the roles the user has. Okay, and yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to guards. So that is going to conclude our NestJS Crash Course. I hope you all enjoyed this whole crash course because I absolutely had so much fun creating this crash course. NestJS is my favorite framework for building Node applications. It's definitely the one that I use all the time whenever I build large applications, even small applications too. I just love the whole structure and everything. But unfortunately, I'm going to have to end the video right here because we are at an hour and a half already, a little bit more than that. There's a lot of different things that we have not even covered, such as sessions, cookies, caching. We haven't covered databases. We haven't even covered authentication. We haven't covered authorization. There are so many things that you can learn with NestJS. And I am so excited to make more videos on NestJS. I hope you all love this video. If you did, feel free to check out my other videos on my channel. I do have separate individual videos for each topic on NestJS, including unit testing and end-to-end testing, so feel free to check those out on my channel. But what next? Well, the next thing that you'll look forward to is learning how to configure authorization and authentication using Passport and sessions, but that will be its own crash course in another video. But what I'll do is I will also put all the code in a GitHub repository, and I'll provide the link in the description. If you need additional help with Nest.js, I do have a Discord server. The link will also be in the description. Feel free to join, stop by, say hi. If you have any questions, need help with code, there are channels where you can ask questions and ask for help. But that is going to be pretty much it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. My name is Jansen, and I'll see you all in my next episode. Peace out.